The last two presentations introduced you to our fifth moral principle, the principle of fidelity. It points to the idea that we ought to be faithful to our commitments and role responsibilities, that we have an obligation to meet people's legitimate expectations of us based upon the specific commitments we have made to them or the roles that we play in relation to them. The previous presentation suggested that we should understand these obligations of fidelity under what we called a covenantal rather than a strictly contractual model. Let's think now about an important issue you will need to keep clear, and that is the relationship or the way in which fidelity overlaps with the other principles, particularly with beneficence, autonomy, and maybe even non-maleficence. You should realize that the specific expectations we have of people because of their professional roles, something we tend to talk about in terms of the principle of fidelity, that those expectations are often with reference to behaviors that also honor other principles. Now, the question arises, do these relevant behaviors relate to fidelity or to those other principles? Let me make this proposal. If the obligation that to which we refer is one that a non-professional would not have, it's best seen as related to fidelity. If the obligation is named in the professional code of ethics, it's best to see it as related to fidelity. Typically, the codes and fidelity names behaviors specific to people in a particular role, even if that behavior could be seen as an expression of one of the other principles. Let's consider some concrete examples related to the principle of beneficence. You will recall that we have said that beneficence is a relatively weak or imperfect duty, or points to weak or imperfect duties, in relation to our duties of non-beneficence. Recall as well Beauchamp and Childress's claims about the obligation to help only actually becoming perfect, where, among other things, there is a minimal risk to oneself. But we've said we would legitimately expect the fireman to enter a burning building at risk to himself. We would expect the fireman to do that, even though we would not find an ordinary civilian. Similarly, we have a legitimate expectation that healthcare professionals treat persons with contagious and deadly diseases, even though that puts them at risk. We would not expect the ordinary person, maybe, to put themselves at risk in that way. All of this suggests then that duty of the fireman to act in a way that promotes the people's welfare who may be in danger in the building, or the physician's duty to treat the patient who has a deadly contagious disease, is best seen as related to the principle of fidelity. It's because of their role that they have those duties, even though those actions are still expressions of the principle of beneficence. They still promote people's welfare. Consider another example. A nurse who does research about best practices in nursing. When asked why she does that research, she appeals to the Code of Ethics, and it's saying that nurses are obligated to contribute to improving the practice of nursing. That, I would say, reflects that she is fulfilling her duties of fidelity, because she only has a duty to promote others' well-being in this particular way because of her role as a nurse, and because that responsibility is particularly cited in her Code of Ethics. Non-nurses have no obligation to contribute to better practices in nursing the way nurses themselves do. And since non-nurses do not have that responsibility, it's a responsibility related to the nurse's role, a responsibility related to fidelity. Later in the course, in our next unit, we'll look at issues related to what are called informed consent requirements. Healthcare professionals operate under a set of requirements that mean they must communicate understandable information to patients so that patients can make their own decisions. And then medical interventions, surgeries, therapies of various sorts, are only considered morally legitimate if patients have given their voluntary informed consent to those interventions. Now, the point I want to make here is that those informed consent requirements are best seen as related to the healthcare professional's role, and thus as matters of fidelity. Now, informed consent requirements are surely thought to be related to both autonomy and beneficence. They enable patients to exercise their self-determination in the medical context, and they promote the choosing of medications and therapies that best promote patient welfare. It is also important to recognize, however, that while all have a duty not to coerce or manipulate, responsibilities, right, clearly related to the principle of autonomy, the professional role creates the additional positive duty to actually act upon the informed decisions of patients. Similarly, while all have a duty not to lie, not to deceive people, the professional role creates the strong or perfect duty to educate and inform. So the point I'm making is the specific obligation that healthcare professionals have to act upon the autonomous decision of patients, the positive responsibility they have to inform patients, go beyond the typical obligations that a non-professional has. Those typical obligations are simply not to coerce or manipulate and not to deceive. But the professional must inform and must act upon autonomous decisions by patients. So if in a particular scenario or situation you're unsure whether to regard the behavior that's required or the behavior that's prohibited as related to fidelity or to another closely related principle, the question to ask yourself is this: is this an obligation shared by all people? An obligation to do or not to do something that all people have? Or is it an obligation that falls almost exclusively on professionals? If it's an obligation unique to those in professional roles, it then is an obligation of fidelity. This concludes our discussion of the 5 moral principles that will guide our reflections in this course. Non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, justice, and fidelity are concepts that help us make sense of and organize our moral convictions, those important beliefs that we bring to our lives as individuals, including our professional lives. You should be warned that these principles do not provide some kind of mathematical formula that enables us to discern exactly what is right and wrong in any particular difficult situation. Their usefulness is primarily in terms of helping us to organize our thoughts, to focus our reflections, and to discern the key issues that are at stake in situations where our obligations are unclear. Well, hopefully all of this has prepared you for the adventure that is before us as we consider important issues in our moral lives.